What I'd like to point out is something that appeared on the website of Representative Rufus Rodriguez. Now, you'll see very clearly spelled out if you visit his website, and we'll be linking to it on our blog, how Christian politicians in Mindanao, some of them issuing fire-breathing statements today about the sacredness of our national territory and its integrity, themselves seriously studied and even proposed secession from the Republic in the past. So when we return, having considered the just claims of the Moros, the pleas of the Lumads, and the history of Christian Filipinos, some of whom are now quite frankly afraid that their livelihoods and homes will be taken away from them, we'll talk to someone who says, now more than ever, the idea of a unified country has to unite public opinion.
The Explainer are available on shelves or on order at a different bookstore.
Today we have with us political analyst and provocative blogger, Dean George Pocobo. Dean, let me begin by asking, now one reason I invited you on this show is that you have some great misgivings about a piece of legislation that has, for example, been pointed out by the Lumads and which at the same time has been used as a principle to help put forward the negotiations of the MILF, and that's the principle of ancestral domain.
Yes.
So if you could go down the reasons.
Well, maps, Manolo, are just lines on a piece of paper, colors on a piece of paper. And yet, today I am terribly saddened by the realization that these maps are being used to divide not just our territory, but our people themselves. When Jose Rizal died, I believe his blood created a whole new nation, one nation, our nation, the Filipino nation. It was his dream that we would become one people. And many Filipinos since his time have worked towards that dream. But an antithesis to his dream arose in 1997, 101 years after he died. It's called Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, which divided our people into two classes, indigenous and non-indigenous. I think many people do not realize who the non-indigenous people are and who the indigenous peoples are. In the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, there's an enumeration of who the indigenous peoples are. They are 110 definite ethnic groups. But the other non-indigenous peoples are the Ilocanos, the Tagalogs, the Pampangos, the Cebuanos, all the Catholicized tribes are considered non-indigenous peoples. Now, I find this terrible because I think it was the beginning of the establishment of a kind of ethno-religious apartheid in our country.
Now, the ostensible reason for the passage of this law was a point that has been raised both in the negotiations with the MILF and with many other groups, which is to correct historical neglect and injustices for minority populations.
Yes.
Therefore, what is wrong with basically saying, look, there have been various groups who do not subscribe to the majority culture that, which happens to be Christian, and therefore need a particular protection and recognition under our laws?
They do, but we all do. And I think the problem with the law is it punishes the people who live in the present for the sins of the past, of our ancestors. And in terms of the non-indigenous peoples, the Ilocanos, the Tagalogs, and Pampangos, is because our ancestors became Catholicized. That is what it says in the law. Now, it may seem like just words, Manolo, but to me, it has a very material and substantive meaning. As it says in the law, ancestral lands and domains are the private property of the indigenous peoples that never fell into the public domain. But then
no,
justice...
Let me pause you there, because you're getting to the heart of the debate. Now, if, just for the sake of discussion, we use the map we were looking at earlier from Blumentritt, which showed you large yellow areas up in northern Luzon and in Mindanao, which, according to the Spaniards anyway, who were dividing us into different classes, were the territories of what they call the pagans, and today we would call the IPs. What the law basically says is that these interior areas, the mountains and forests where they traditionally lived anyway, should be theirs.
Well,
Now, you're saying, so these are not areas, by the way, that at least traditionally were the habitation of other groups.
well,
So what the problem now becomes, what is the problem?
well, if you take seriously the law, we would be creating 110 separate Bangsamoro lands. 110 separate indigenous people's homelands. That's what we would have to do to maintain equal protection, because it isn't only the Bangsamoro that are considered indigenous peoples, it's all those Lumads that you were quoting there. And I think that it is impossible to actually implement that idea. We are one nation. It is like the Merchant of Venice. We may owe these people something, as you said, an historical injustice to be corrected. But in order to extract that pound of flesh, we would all have to bleed to death. Because we are now one people. We're all together in Mindanao, right? It's Christians, Muslims, Lumas, they're all mixed in together. And when you look at the law, it says indigenous peoples are those peoples that by ascription or ascription by others are indigenous. Or in the MOA itself, it says if a Muslim marries a Catholic, they have children, their children become part of Bangsamoro. So what I'm saying is, what we are doing here is no different than what the South African racists tried to do. They tried to create something separate and equal, and then to create homelands for the blacks, and then keep the whites in one place, keep the blacks in another place. But it's worse than that in our case, because if I put a Bangsamoro indigenous person, a Lumad, and a Catholic together, without their clothes on, just by themselves, you couldn't tell who was which. Whereas blacks and whites, at least you could tell who was black and who was white. Now we can't. In our case, what I'm saying, Manolo, is that we are one nation, and that is what we must fight for. We are now at the same stage that the Americans were in 1861, when their Southern Confederacy tried to secede and keep their slaves, keep their way of life, keep their ancestral homeland, according to them.
But you know, Dean, what's happening there is that basically your innate right is to describe yourself and identify yourself in whichever way you would prefer. And if there are, for example, in the case of the various Filipino Muslims, they believe that they are entitled to a particular measure, at the very least, of autonomy, because they have been denied the substance of charting their own destiny for so long. Now, what we have here in our audience are members of the Young Moro League, and they have their own particular views, and I wish you join in and tell us what you think. But here's one particular reason why I wanted to bring this up. Your view is representative of quite a few people. And if we look at the particular instance of Mindanao, where areas that were traditionally ascribed either to the Moros or the Lumads or whoever, the frank reality is that there has been an influx of Christian settlers for several generations.
Yes.
And that they subscribe to a particular way of looking at their possessions and territory, their land. Is there a fundamental difference? For example, if I were a Christian settler in a part that used to be Muslim, and now I own property, how does this IP law affect me?
Well, I think that this IP law tries to do something which is impossible to do, which is really to try to distinguish peoples that are inextricably mixed. Human beings have lived in the Philippines for over 30,000 years. That's what scientists tell us. You know, when they say time immemorial, I'll go back to the old Iron Age. I'd go back to the Paleolithic. You know, so
no, but we have here in our audience people who do view themselves in a certain way, and your view that we should all make an effort to submerge ourselves to a common Filipino identity. How do you feel about that?
But before that, Manolo, we have a text message here from one of our viewers. His name is Manny. He asks, is the Dean calling for reappeal of IPRA?
Yes, I am. I think that this law, whose constitutionality, by the way, was upheld by a very narrow, it was Part 7 to 7 PI in December 2000, is a form of ethno-religious apartheid. That's what it is. It is detestable in my mind. It's a treason against Rizal's vision of one nation. Yes, we have differences. Of course we're different. But are we that different? When you scratch each other, do we not bleed? We are human beings before we are Filipinos. And we are Filipinos before we are Lumads or Muslims or Christians.
Okay, with your assertion there, Dean, we are Filipinos before we are Christians or Lumads or Muslims. How do you feel about this?
Yes, we have a question here from Jihad.
Sir, my question is, you stated